Slavery and Indentured Servitude by Victoria Bider. I honestly didn't realize until this week's material that there were two types of servitude in America, slavery and indentured servitude. It seems from our discussion that a lot of other people didn't realize it either. So, what are some of the differences between slavery and indentured servitude? Slaves were brought over from Africa through the Atlantic slave trade. Slaves were bound to their masters for life, and so were their children. It is appalling how some of the accounts refer to the slaves as farm animals, who are bought as an investment. Reading about these investments and transactions, and how slaves would pay for themselves after the first 4 years, and then the masters could have nothing but gain afterwards, was extremely disturbing. It seems that there were rare exceptions to gaining freedom if a master really loved one of his slaves, and if the slave proved them loyalty. The master could then send the slave to one of the free states. The government could also free a slave. Slaves were not paid, they were given food and a place to live, and the generosity of these necessities depended on the master. A kinder master could give his slaves more food and not work them as hard, for example in the scorching heat, while a malevolent master would do unspeakable things. Some of the excerpts mention how it wasn't in the master's best interest to make his slaves sick or unwell, but keeping someone alive for the sake of how much they are worth and how much work they can do for you is not the same as giving them good quality of life. Indentured servants came from Europe and received a pass to America by promising years of servitude. I think one of the main distinctions was that it was the person's choice to do this. Of course, there were some circumstances, such as paying for a crime, that made this a court-ordered decision. Another distinction is that indentured servants would gain freedom and land for men after their contract ended. They had higher status and better treatment than slaves, and were protected by the courts, supposedly. If an indentured servant was mistreated, he could be moved to another master. Slaves were bought by their masters, and even killing them wasn't a crime. White women, for example, had taxes put on them so that they did not have to work out in the fields, whereas black women worked in the outdoors just like men. White men were often made into overseers on the plantations. Robert Beverly was an influential planter. His goal was to appease people's minds about the treatment of slaves and indentured servants by explaining the laws around the two groups. He was specifically trying to argue that the views and reputation of indentured workers in England was wrong and nowhere near as cruel or awful as some people in England thought it to be. Here is a quote from the reading where he says the following: "Because I have heard how strangely cruel and severe the service of this country, use of slaves and servants in Virginia, is presented to some parts of England, I can't forbear affirming that the work of their servants and slaves is no other than what every common freeman does. Neither is any servant required to do more in a day than his overseer, and I can assure you with great truth that generally their slaves are not worked near so hard nor so many hours in a day as the husbandmen and day laborers in England." I do believe that it was in the best interest of planters to come off as kinder than they were in order to continue the practices of indentured servitude and slavery without the shaming or resistance of the outside world. I think it was good for business. I also find it very interesting that planters cared about their reputation. Surely, if they were trying to prove to the world they weren't so bad, it means they saw some wrong in what they were doing. Profitable Advice for Rich and Poor was a pamphlet directed at poor Englishmen which encouraged them to take advantage of the colonies. In the 1712 pamphlet, John Norris, a South Carolina planter, talks to Simon Question, an English farmer. This piece is promotional. In order to encourage the business of moving to the colonies, Norris describes the work done by indentured servants and slaves the same as the work being done by the men and women in England. He even says that the work in England is more difficult. He talks about how, after serving their 4-year term, servants can get their own land and start their own business, and it's not common for a freeman to become hired help since they have the ability to be the boss. Even though I found it absolutely appalling, I also found it morbidly interesting how all of this is described in a very businesslike manner. He talks about how servants who become free and receive land from land proprietors can also get loans to start up um, their business from shops and neighbors in town, almost like a credit line. He also speaks of slaves as an investment that pays itself off fairly quickly and then have masters have nothing but free gain. It is despicable to read these things about slaves who are human beings. What I found interesting is how similar the ideas behind how the economy works in 1712, with the difference being human beings instead of machines making the products. Similar to our time, I mean. I kept thinking about the ideas behind buying a good machine in a factory that will just pay itself off and then provide gain afterwards. Reverend Hugh Jones is an English clergyman returning from Virginia to England, who has some strong opinions about servitude in the colonies. To begin, he believes that there are too many slaves and they get treated better than servants. He says slaves eat better bread and masters have more of a reason to care for their health. He believed that it would be in the best interest of the public and the poor if the number of slaves were lower and they could have their jobs. He states, "But to me it seems to be more prudence and charity for our own poor and vagabonds to be there employed and provided for than for us to maintain and use such great numbers of Africans." Um, He basically feels that slaves are taking away jobs and opportunities from the poor, which sounds pretty ridiculous when you think about it. One thing that I found interesting that was different than other accounts is Johnson's mention of how Africans affected the culture in the colonies with the way they talked and acted. I would think that slaves would mostly be ignored, seeing as they weren't even treated as humans, but to understand that they had an influence on culture so early on is pretty eye-opening. William Morley, a previously indentured servant, describes servitude in America in a much more grim way than seen in the other accounts. He talks about how badly slaves are treated with the harshest of punishments. He says killing a slave is not a big deal, and men don't even get punished for such an act. He describes that gaining freedom for a slave is nearly impossible. His account of indentured servants is not great either. While indentured servants do not have it as bad as slaves, their agreed upon conditions are often not met. Their basic necessities of clothing and food are not always met, and in court a master is always heard first over a servant, making it an unfair trial. Afterwards the servant might get punished. Escaping for servants is impossible because masters put rewards on finding them. Johann Martin Bolzius was the leader of the Ebenezer settlement of German Lutherans in Georgia. He was the creator of yet another promotional pamphlet to try and get more German settlers into the colonies. In his pamphlet he provided some more specific information about how many slaves are needed when first starting up. He also seems a bit miffed at how men do not uphold the laws when it comes to slaves, sleeping with enslaved women and making loyal slaves into overseers over white servants. He does admit that some slaves hurt or kill their masters, but for the most part they try to run away, although it is nearly impossible to do so. He explains that slaves can get freedom when it is granted by the government, or a master can petition on their behalf. He also says that there is no limit on how many slaves a master can have and the cost of their upkeeping is pretty low. Once again, this is talked about in a very businesslike manner in terms of money. He goes on to say that indentured servants are treated almost as badly as slaves, but do have better treatment in Georgia where he lives rather than in Carolina. He describes them as lazy and even sarcastically says that they don't even want to work the quote unquote few years they are indentured to do so. While it seems that being a slave and indentured servant were both horrific, I do believe that slavery was much, much worse. Slaves could be killed without repercussions, and they were enslaved for life, living and working under horrible conditions and always in fear of physical punishment and being separated from their families. Indentured servants often received bad treatment with promises broken about their living conditions when they arrived in the colonies. The master would often win out in court just for being a master, and so they didn't have much of a way out of their situation. The planters tried to make it seem like there are all these laws protecting them, but it's kind of like when you go to court to argue a ticket with a cop. The court almost always favors the cop because they trust them more. There may have been laws, but they didn't do much protecting. Everything was driven by money and greed, which is not much different than today, and there was a lot of propaganda involved in creating this amazing image of the colonies. I find it kind of interesting that this sentiment of America being the best and ahead of everyone and the richest is still very much felt today. It seems as though those kind of strong notions had early roots, and a lot of it was based in making the picture appear better than it was, just as it is today. Most slaves working in southern plantations had the harshest of conditions. They were worked day and night regardless of how hot or cold it was or if it was raining, for example. In their accounts, planters tried to make it seem like it wasn't in the best interest of the masters to mistreat their slaves. It was better to have them strong and healthy. But we all know that people are often cruel and want to display power. John W. Fields, a previously enslaved man in Kentucky, recounts a story about a woman who couldn't work as hard as her slaveholder wanted. That night he whipped her and made other slaves pour salt water in her wounds. That's how slaves were really treated, not the sugar-coated descriptions of the planters and reverends. It does seem like there were masters that were kinder and gentler, but at the end of the day, they were still denying people of their freedom, so kindness doesn't quite seem like enough. I don't see that there was a lot of identity and accomplishment in the way slaves felt about their work. I believe they derived those things from their families and friends. They would sing in the fields, drink and dance on nights they had off, if they had nights off. Some of the accounts talked about how young people these days, well, in their days, don't understand what it was like to be enslaved. I think maybe some slaves did get a sort of identity and strength from the hard work they performed, but I don't see these as accomplishments per se, as they were forced to do these things. I think some slaves realized that their owners were much kinder than other owners, and their lives could have been a lot worse. This is why they felt an affection towards their owners, but it is also because it is the only life they knew. You can't miss what you've never had. I'm sure some slaves, especially those working inside of the households and around children, grew close and affectionate towards the families. I can see how that would happen, especially if they were treated in a better manner. But I think all slaves wished to be free and hated the institution of slavery. Thank you for listening to my presentation.